The palace on the sea pretends to be a ship at anchor. Columns like masts, silk like sails, lanterns swaying in the Alexandrian night. Inside, the floor is a map of rivers and gods. Outside, the harbor holds its breath. Perfume moves through the corridors like a rumor that learned to dance. A table blooms with impossible things. Figs colder than the moon, wine the color of old rubies, little dishes that whisper salt and thunder. And upon the couch at the head of the room reclines a queen the world thinks it knows, wearing history like a serpent in her hair. They call these the velvet banquets, suppers where loyalty arrived on silver and left on foot if it could. A Roman general with lion shoulders laughs too loud. A rival priest of a crocodile god finds his throat suddenly dry. A poet counts how many smiles mean mercy and how many do not. Somewhere a cupbearer touches the rim of a chalice to his own lip, just a ghost of a kiss, to prove the knight still loves him. You have heard the stories. Pearls melted for a single swallow, coins of gold ground and stirred into honey, servants taught to breathe like shadows. But stories do not tell you how quiet a room becomes when a woman who refuses to be conquered raises a cup and looks at you. As if the Nile itself has asked a question, who survived? Cleopatra's velvet banquets. Those nights where power tasted like fruit and fear wore perfume? Tonight, you will know why. Egypt is not a country tonight. It is a fragrance with borders. Alexandria hums like a jeweled hive, and the queen who keeps the honey knows that empires are won between sips. Fact, her name is Cleopatra Selene, last of the Ptolemies, a scholar queen who speaks with scholars in Greek and Egyptian, who rules a library and a fleet, and who once sailed upriver with Julius Caesar, and later summoned Mark Antony to Tarsus in 41 BCE. A meeting staged like a miracle on a gilded barge. Rome calls it seduction. Egypt calls it policy. She learned young that a banquet can do what an army cannot. Tables gather enemies inside a single reach of the hand. Music teaches men to forget the heights they fell from to sit here. Torches comb the velvet with gold. The queen reclines with the ease of someone who has memorized the names of everyone else's hunger. Cupbearers move like punctuation. Breath pour pause, so the sentences of the night do not run into each other and become war. Rumor, those cups are not merely wine. In one is a false antidote, a tincture that warms the throat and convinces a nervous guest that all is well. In another, harmless vinegar meant to dress a wager as wonder. In a third, the tiniest breath of something that makes tongues slow and promises are signed by silence. They say a priest of Serapis taught her the difference between a cure and a threat that feels like a cure. They say she has a ring set with a little thorn of glass to break over a chalice if Rome ever forgets its manners. All this splendor has a clock in it. Fact, the world has tilted since Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE. Antony holds the east, Octavian the west. Lepidus is a title more than a man. Egypt must become indispensable or become geography. So Cleopatra rehearses miracles, pearls that might melt, perfumes that could buy an army, nights that remind Rome how expensive it is to be loved properly. Listen to how quiet fear can be when it is dressed in silk. A general laughs and glances at his cup to check whether he owns the laugh. A poet lowers his eyes and composes a line he will never say aloud. A rival queen, absent but always present, breathes like a draught under the door. Her name is Rome, and she has no patience for soft power that works. Some historians insist this part was exaggerated to ruin a reputation, but the private letters from that winter suggest something else. They suggest invoices for spices and rare resins tallied beside lists of guests. They suggest dock ledgers for pearl shipments that match the dates of wages. They suggest that what Rome called sin, Egypt called accounting. The Nile pushes its slow sermon against the quay. Lanterns blink like careful eyes. A servant polishes a chalice until it reflects only the queen and the person she is looking at. The banquet smiles. The knives are somewhere else tonight, somewhere inside the music. And you who have been invited to survive, learn the first rule of these rooms. No one drinks alone here, not even the queen. Begin with a girl who learns to count enemies before she can count constellations. The Ptolemaic palace is a chessboard with warm blood. Siblings smile like knives laid flat. Fact, Cleopatra VII is made co-ruler with Ptolemy III and soon driven into exile, 48 BCE, to Syria and the eastern marches, raising troops to take back what her cradle promised. Alexandria, which loves spectacle, receives a better one than theatre can buy. The siege of Alexandria, 48-47 BCE, Julius Caesar caught in the city's quarrels, and a queen who refuses to let Rome decide what Egypt may be. They say she came to him rolled in a carpet, or in a sack of linens, or hidden in a basket of laundry, like a story that already knew how it wanted to be told. The detail changes with the teller. The lesson does not. Cleopatra will arrive where decisions are being made, even if the door has been taught to forget her name. The wound is not humiliation alone. It is dispossession. That peculiar cold left by brothers who call your crown a courtesy, and ministers who measure your breath against their stipends. It is Rome's stare, amused and suspicious, that sees the Nile as a purse and the queen as its clasp. She learns to breathe like a tide. Approach, withdraw, return with moonlight on her back and sharks under it. Fact, when the fighting settles, Caesar remains, and Caesarion is born, 47 BCE. Egypt inhales, Rome scowls. Later, after Caesar's murder, 44 BCE, the queen writes to the future with her decisions, to Tarsus, 41 BCE, to Mark Antony, to a partnership that turns banquets into embassies and embraces into treaties. The world will pretend this is romance. Policy smiles and lets the world pretend. Rumor. The night Caesar first heard her voice, she spoke in Greek until the room relaxed, then in Egyptian until the walls remembered whom they belonged to. Another rumor keeps a smaller room, a library chamber, smoke suite, where a young queen ran her fingers over papyrus catalogues as if stroking the fur of a living animal. When soldiers' torches licked the shelves, she wept without sound and promised that Rome would pay interest on ashes. There is also a darker whisper, that the queen kept a small cabinet labeled theriaca, antidotes tested on condemned men by physicians who believed knowledge requires suffering. Truth and cruelty are cousins in palaces. Some historians insist this part was exaggerated to ruin a reputation, but the private letters from that winter suggest something else. They suggest pharmacy lists cross-checked with shipping logs, a note about opobalsamum and nard and the price of a good myrrh, payments to a scholar from Pergamon for advice on pearls, vinegar, and how to enact a wager that feels like a miracle, but leaves the guest alive to tell it. The wound makes a method. Cleopatra will never again enter a room as a petitioner. She will arrive as a climate, perfume, music, mathematics, so that men cannot separate their desires from their conclusions. She will host dinners where Roman generals forget which empire is feeding whom. She will learn to move allies like boats between islands of offense. She will memorize the appetites of poets and quartermasters, priests and quartermasters' wives. She will make the table a frontier and teach boarders to obey the hand that pours. Outside, the harbor keeps its slow applause. The Pharos cuts the dark into obedient pieces. In the queen's chambers, someone arranges pearls on a plate, and someone else grinds a handful of salt until it remembers the sea. Cleopatra studies lists, guests, ships, debts, and then looks in a small bronze mirror and studies the one thing Rome never learned to read correctly, a woman who found a way to make survival look like hospitality. Call it a treaty written in perfume. When Mark Antony summons Cleopatra to Tarsus, 41 BCE, she answers not with parchment but with weather, a barge roofed in gold cloth, purple sails, oars that beat the river like a drumline of swans. The air smells of cassia and honeyed wine. Musicians play a road under the water for the ship to walk upon. Fact, ancient sources agree on the spectacle. What they disagree on is whether Antony surrendered to love or to logistics. Egypt's queen knows it does not matter. She offers him the only alliance Rome cannot counterfeit, a future where both survive. They dine as if the world is a guest who might leave early. Antony, lion-shouldered and starved for admiration, learns that admiration here carries weapons under the table. Cleopatra talks not of roses, but of grain quotas, fleet rebuilds, and which Syrian towns will kiss which rings. She can laugh like a girl and audit like a war office. He recognizes with relief that tastes like sin, a partner who can turn his hunger for glory into a plan that feeds armies. Rumor: the pearl wager is born here, or soon after at Alexandria. She will swallow a fortune to prove Egypt's banquets can buy anything Rome desires. One version says she dissolves the gem in vinegar, another that the pearl is softened in strong wine and theatrics, another that she merely threatens the swallow and wins the bet on nerve. Whatever the recipe, what matters is the arithmetic. A queen who can make wealth into applause can make obedience into policy. A second whisper says that as cups circulate, certain cups return, always, to the same men, because a memory sits in the queen's palm counting favors, and the number of days a soldier can march on a promise. Fact: by 4140 BCE, Antony winters in Alexandria. Twins are born, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, bindings written in blood and cradle songs. In time, donations of Alexandria, 34 BCE, will declare kingdoms for their children. Rome will call this treason dressed as generosity. But tonight is for silk diplomacy. Antony gives her Cyprus on a map. She gives him Rome's laughter turned respectful. He will still be Roman in armor and oath. In the dark rooms, he will be something else. Useful. Some historians insist this. Part was exaggerated to ruin a reputation, but the private letters from that winter suggest something else. They suggest shipments of grain routed to Antioch per a new schedule, Alexandrian ledgers noting bonuses for sailors who keep secrets, a Roman quartermaster's complaint that the Queen's perfume merchants somehow outrank his messengers at the dock. Exaggeration or not, the math balances. If Antony eats here, his legions will not starve. The forbidden bond is not merely lovers on couches, it is sovereignty married to ambition, her throne needing his sword needing her treasury, and the kind of worship Rome refuses to give its generals while they are alive. Around the table tonight sit future biographies pretending to be men. Cups go round. The Nile outside keeps impartial time. Cleopatra asks Antony a question with her eyes that even historians cannot footnote. Do you want to win, or do you want to belong? He lifts his cup. The room chooses with him. Some survive these banquets because they understand the rules, speak lightly, promise firmly, drink only after the queen has tasted, and never ask whether the miracle is chemistry or theater. Those who do not understand become footnotes, then ash. The bond is sealed, not with kisses, but with the first convoy that leaves harbor at dawn under a Roman eagle and an Egyptian sun carved on the same crate. Power in Alexandria does not march. It entertains. The city learned this from pharaohs and improved it with libraries. Cleopatra perfects the lesson, spectacle as policy. Curtains part the way boarders do when a navy arrives on time. Musicians tune a treaty. Servants conduct like diplomats in linen. Fact: by 34 BCE, the donations of Alexandria will stage a coronation as theater. Antony and Cleopatra enthroned, their children titled over future kingdoms, an announcement to Rome delivered as pageant. Octavian will call it arrogance. Egypt calls it budgeting in public. But the velvet banquets are where the arithmetic happens quietly. Seating is a diagram of tomorrow's map. To Cleopatra's right, the officer who must be brave on short rations. To her left, the shipwright whose timbers decide whether a storm becomes a disaster. Farther down, poets and priests because empires run on stories and permission. Cups circulate in patterns only she understands. The same honeyed wine returns to the same hands. Comfort is also surveillance. The vinegar appears only when a wager needs a miracle that will not kill anyone important. Fact, Antony and Cleopatra found a supper club with a laughing, named the Inimitable Livers, whose evenings are remembered as if luxury itself had learned to sign its name. They dine on rare fish, figs freckled with crushed snow, sauces that taste like ports you will never afford to conquer. But notice the ledger under the lace. Guests leave with assignments, ships leave with schedules, and the Queen's Chamberlain leaves with a list of promises whose ink will be checked against the sunrise. Rumor, not all cups are equal. One cools panic. One warms courage. One has a ghost of a drug that loosens tongues enough to confess a quarrel before it becomes a plot. Another rumor says a little casket sits within reach, theriaca and other antidotes, so that the Queen can drink after anyone and prove in the same motion her fearlessness and her pharmacy. The priest of Imhotep is said to watch the room the way physicians watch a fever. Pulse, color, speech. Men who cannot pass this examination are not invited twice. Some historians insist this part was exaggerated to ruin a reputation, but the private letters from that winter suggest something else. They suggest payments to herb dealers on course, notes on opium cut with wine, a recipe in a scribe's hand labeled for seasick generals and liars both. They also suggest careful orders to the harbor. When a Roman cohort arrives drunk on its own rumor, feed the tribunes, weigh the grain, delay the band. Silk can threaten more quietly than iron. A toast that includes your enemy's name with a compliment is a leash. A chair moved 2 places down is a demotion signed in upholstery. A pearl dangled above a cup is a sermon on the price of loyalty. If the Queen can dissolve wealth for applause, she can also dissolve a man's faction without raising her voice. Men leave these rooms stunned by beauty and certain somehow of their new duties. They call it enchantment. Accountants call it throughput. Outside, the sea rehearses Actium without knowing it. Galleys blink their oar-eyes in the moon. Inside, Antony laughs, easier now, because Cleopatra's banquets have taught him a truth Rome never will, that obedience sweetened travels further than obedience flogged. He thinks the night has forgiven him his ambitions. The night has merely hired them. The Queen lifts her cup. No one drinks alone here, not even she. The lace at her wrist trembles with the most ruthless kindness you will ever see. Tomorrow the port will be busy. The temples generous, the scribes smug. Tonight the empire learns between figs and fear that silk is a blade if you pull it fast enough. The sea keeps its own calendar. On it, laughter is a forecast. By 3231 BCE, the jokes in Alexandria grow brittle. Octavian reads the stolen will of Antony in Rome and turns donations into evidence, love into treason. War is declared not on a Roman, but on a queen, Cleopatra, so that men who fear romance can pretend to defend law. Fact, Actium. 2nd September 31 BCE. The wind is wrong, the oars are tired. The admirals argue with maps. In the smoke, the Alexandrian squadron cuts free. Cleopatra's flagship turns for open water, and Antony, who has never learned to love anything moderately, follows. Octavian's general Agrippa eats the stragglers for breakfast. Rome will say she fled. Egypt will say she preserved what could still be spent. Ships treasure a last currency called time. That night, back in a room where the lamps still know her name, the Queen sets one more table. They do not call it a banquet, but the bowls are polished like memory. The singers remember their lines. A cupbearer's hand does not shake because he has taught it not to. Antony arrives with the look of a man who has been hugged by thunder. She does not touch his wounds with pity. She touches them with logistics. The grain routes, the Arabian overtures, the Nubian gold still loyal, the Egyptian fleet that remains. We can still feed an army, she says, and the room hums like a hive that has lost its queen only to discover it has not. Rumor, this was the last meeting of the Inimitable Livers. No costumes, no pearls. Only the old rule that nobody drinks alone. Another whisper says she lifted a cup that night, which was not wine, and looked at it the way a mathematician looks at an equation with only one solution. A third says she wore at her wrist a tiny phial the color of obedience. None of the whispers agree because grief rarely footnotes itself. Some historians insist this part was exaggerated to ruin a reputation, but the private letters from that winter suggest something else. They suggest orders to refit triremes at Pelusium, a courier to Herod that never returned, and a note in a quartermaster's hand. If Rome offers pardon to sailors, pay them first and send them home full. Even defeats must be accounted. Fact: in 30 BCE, Octavian comes to the Nile. Antony's last charge fails. He falls on his sword and is brought to her, bleeding and enormous with regret. The city holds its breath the way a harbor holds wreckage. Cleopatra disappears into a mausoleum with gold, with portraits, with anything that can still be traded for terms. Octavian sends envoys, honeyed precise, because even triumph needs cooperation to look tidy. The room that night is bare of velvet, but the queen still hosts. She tests every exit like a physician tests a pulse. Ransom, exile, her last treaty that calls itself surrender. The only untested exit sits in a basket at her feet, coiled like a sentence. The rumor names it asp. Another rumor names it ointment, a cocktail learned from physicians who never learned to fear the patient. She strokes the idea the way one strokes an animal that knows only one trick. My ending was already signed, she says, perhaps to a maid, perhaps to the heir. Perhaps she means Actium, perhaps Caesar in a linen sack. Perhaps the day Rome decided to fear a woman who could make loyalty taste like dessert. She kisses the hand of a servant with a gratitude that feels like a benediction. Outside, the Nile rehearses how to forget. Morning moves in Roman. Octavian enters Alexandria as if he invented doors. Fact: Antony is dead. Cleopatra dies August 30th. BCE by causes the poets will turn into a serpent, because serpents rhyme with queens and fear. Caesarion, the boy who looked too much like an answer, dies on Octavian's order. Dio gives the phrase, there can be too many Caesars. The twins survive. Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene taken into Roman care. Later, Cleopatra Selene will marry Juba the sect of Mauritania and teach another shore to speak Egyptian in its sleep. Octavian will parade a model Nile in his triumph, 29 BCE, and rename himself Augustus. The world will learn to praise efficiency as if it were mercy. Erasure travels fast when written on victory. Scribes tidy the banquets into slanders. The pearl wager becomes vanity instead of arithmetic. Pharmacy becomes witchcraft. Diplomacy becomes debauch. Poets with government stipends furnish morals to match the statues. Rooms that once smelled of cassia are fumigated with Latin forbidden rumor. Octavian keeps the queen alive an extra day to practice his speech, then discovers that queens with their own endings ruin a good paragraph. Another whisper says the mausoleum still holds a cup with a crack in it, and 2 rings, one Roman, one Egyptian, tied with a thread the color of the middle of the night. A more practical rumor says the palace accountants were spared because even conquerors prefer ledgers that know how to spell yesterday. Some historians insist this part was exaggerated to ruin a reputation, but the private letters from that winter suggest something else. They suggest inventories of perfume stores confiscated and sent to Rome, sailors paid off and discharged, and a short, irritated note from a Roman official: the queen's household knows too well how to be useful. Usefulness survives where beauty cannot. So, who survived Cleopatra's velvet banquets? Not the arrogant, not the men who forgot which ship they were on. The survivors were the ones who learned her rules and then practiced them under the new weather. The scribe who could translate appetite into schedule. The cupbearer who knew when to sip and when to smile. the shipwright whose timbers kept their promises, the priest who could bless a treaty without choking, and one young woman, Cleopatra Selene, who carried away the last intact inheritance, the talent for turning hospitality into a country. Walk the harbor at dusk, and the wind will still smell faintly of myrrh, as if the city remembers the mathematics of her nights. How a cup could be a covenant, how a pearl could be a budget, how a banquet could feed an army. Rome will call it legend. Merchants will call it throughput. The Nile calls it memory. The lanterns on the quay are small now, like patient stars. Let Alexandria fold back into water and hush. Let the banquet couches become shadows again. You are not in those rooms, listening for which cup is safety. You are here where the only drink is breath in. Hold, and out slowly, like a tide that has decided to forgive the shore. We walked among velvet and iron, where a queen balanced empires on the rim of a chalice and asked terrible, beautiful questions without words. We watched a general mistake applause for policy. We watched a city learn to survive by telling its story in another grammar. Between the facts and the rumors, something true kept shining, that kindness and calculation can dress alike, and that survival done exquisitely can look like love. Set it down now, the pearls, the vinegar, the barge with purple sails. Imagine the Pharaoh's lighthouse dimming to a glow only sailors can see. Imagine the last cup turned upside down, a silent promise that nothing more will be asked of you tonight. Another breath. If a serpent of thought curls at the edge of sleep, let it uncoil and go. If a Roman trumpet sounds in the distance, let the river answer it with quiet. You owe no oaths here. You belong to the soft kingdom of now. The final lamp sighs and goes out, leaving only the moon drawing a silver path on the water. Follow it with your breathing. Rest.